So I'm a soil scientist. I'm starting to notice the pattern of the talks from one another to another. And so what I'm going to do today is just to talk about some of the kind of concepts that I think are quite exciting and interesting and revolutionary in soil science at the moment. I'll have a slightly easy ride because Kate has already introduced concepts that I want to introduce as well. I'll show you a little bit of the work or the data that I've been working on as well, and try and keep that to a minimum because I don't think you want to see lots of graphs. But then at the end of my talk I'll make an attempt to try and think about whether farmers may or may not want to invest in soil and what type of people may or may not be persuaded to do so. And I'll highlight that I'm not very qualified to do that, but I think there's people in the room that are, so that's very much a first attempt for me, and an attempt to try and get you to help me and stimulate some discussion on this. So my first slide is taken from a workshop that we held in Reading about this time last year, where we were talking about this concept of soil health. And I think David said yesterday that when we're talking about soil quality, which is a very similar concept, that there's a lot that soil scientists kind of disagree about. We're very good at kind of arguing with each other about what's important, but actually the reason why I put this slide up here is because if there is one thing that soil scientists tend to broadly agree on, is that we think that organic matter is important. So we think that's very underpinning, and we think it's an important component of the health or the quality of the soil. And so we have all these other ways that you might want to measure or indicate soil health, so things like water retention, pH, the nutrients, some earthworms, microbe structure, but organic matter is the one on the far left-hand side that almost everybody agrees should be in there somewhere and is important. And so I'd just like to dwell on sort of what is organic matter and how organic matter turns into soil organic matter. And so whether you're farming in an urban garden or whether you're farming thousands of hectares of fields, there's various ways that you can get organic matter into soil. So you can add manure into that soil, you can add composts or other agricultural wastes. You can grow plants with the explicit intention to kill that plant, not harvest anything, and put the entire biomass into the ground. And in fact, the very act of having a plant in the soil, it will start pumping carbon out the bottom of its roots into the soil with the intention of feeding the biology in the soil. And so soils that have a high concentration of organic matter, soil organic matter, tend to hold water slightly better. They have a better structure, these aggregates that again Kate was talking about seem to form. Some of that organic matter forms part of the microbial biomass, the life that lives in soil, not just microbes, but the entire food web. And then this sort of helps us to sort of infiltrate water into the soil and provide these various functions that produce benefits for humans, essentially. So soils with higher organic matter tend to have higher yields of crops. They tend to have higher crop quality, so whatever attributes that you're looking for in your crop can be enhanced by having a soil with a high amount of organic matter. And there's also ancillary benefits as well, so it can help to reduce the erosion of the soil, so to prevent less of it ended up in the river and impacting upon the water quality, and to help more of it stay on the field, so that it creates a slightly more sustainable system. And so, again, so Kate's kind of slightly scooped this revolution I was going to introduce you to as well. But, and you showed a picture, a figure from a famous paper in Nature in 2011. And I've essentially kind of redrawn this, and I'll tell the story a little bit how I like to tell it. So, decades ago, when scientists were looking at the organic matter in soil and they were carbon dating that organic matter, they discovered that some of that organic matter in the soil was in fact up to thousands of years old in some cases. And so the traditional theory of how that soil organic matter became to be thousands of years old was essentially a case of probability. So So they thought, well, okay, a piece of organic matter, whether it's a cover crop or a piece of straw or a leaf, for example, from a tree, would have been degraded, and some of the compounds within that leaf or whatever would be very resistant to degradation, and just by chance there would be some of those molecules that would just never get around to being eaten by something and then remain in that soil. And this is this concept or this idea of humus in the soil. Current or emerging thinking is that actually that's not the great case. And in a very short space of time, all of the organic matter, so for example the crop residues, which is what I tend to focus some of my research on, most of it, in fact almost all of it, gets metabolized relatively quickly by the soil food web. And so you'll have to use your imagination with the soil food web, because I'm not very good at drawing soil printers, but so these bacterial cells here represent the other life that lives in soil. And so within a year or two, the majority, and again, I don't want to put too many numbers on this, but I would hazard maybe 90% or so of that carbon that was added into the soil becomes carbon dioxide, because those organisms are respiring and they're using it for energy. Now, a small amount of that carbon will move into what we might call the microbial net biomass, and that's what Kate was saying is dead microbes, not just dead microbes, but dead other soil organisms, so nematodes, collembola, mites, and earthworms that I'll come on to talk about in a moment. And it can also be the molecules that are produced and excreted by these, or secreted by these microbes as well, so they don't have to die to be sending these carbon compounds out into the soil. And then there's these two primary mechanisms by which that soil organic matter is stabilized and prevented from being eaten or metabolized by microorganisms. And one of them is the aggregates, again, that Kate talked about, the idea that something can be physically protected, so encased in this sort of tomb that is the aggregate, and the carbon is in the center, and the carbon helps keep the aggregate stable, and the aggregate helps keep the carbon protected from being metabolized. But there's also chemical sorption as well, so these compounds can stick to the surfaces of the soil. And so certain soils that have a higher surface area, so a higher clay content, so maybe less sand and more clay, they tend to have a greater capability to trap and keep more carbon. But having said that, these aggregates break down, and this organic matter comes and detaches from the surfaces of the soil, and then it goes back into this microbial or the food web, and then it can be metabolized, turned into carbon dioxide, or it could be secreted once again, so it cycles round. So these carbon compounds that have been in the soil for perhaps up to thousands of years may have been through this loop several times, and by chance that carbon compound never went up into the atmosphere, and it just happened to cycle around in this loop for many, many times. However, the bits that I'm more interested in at the moment, at least for the purposes of this talk, is not so much the stable carbon, but actually it's the biology in the centre. So this is not my artwork, I might just add. It's the stuff that lives in soils and the organisms that are doing things for us. So when something is respiring and producing carbon dioxide, sometimes they're doing work, and that work can be for the benefit of the soil and could possibly be for the benefit of humans that are using the soil in order to do something such as growing a plant. And I particularly want to focus on organisms that improve structure. And Kate, quite rightly, I don't disagree with anything that Kate said, that microorganisms are very important for improving the soil structure, but actually I'm going to focus on earthworms and the importance that they play in soil structure. So on the left-hand side it's a little bit light-coloured, but there's a time-lapse photography of some earthworms moving up and down their burrows. And the purpose of this slide is really to talk about the influence of the earthworms on that structure of the soil. So they're moving through the soil and they're creating these big macropores, and they're also producing casts, so worm poop. And some of these casts can be very stable and hard, and some of them can actually dissipate very quickly as well, depending on the species. And so broadly speaking, we have 3 different ecological groups of earthworms, and I'll just quickly introduce you to them. So we have these surface-dwelling earthworms, and these mostly move around on the surface of the soil. They don't often burrow into the soil, and they take this fresh organic matter. So you tend to find them in, say, forests or places where we have lots of litter left permanently on the surface. And so they break down that litter and they turn it into little compost heaps essentially on the surface of the soil. And the second type is these vertical burrowing earthworms. So they have these permanent vertical burrows, and they come up out of their burrows, usually in the night time, and they drag stuff from the surface, so some of that litter from the surface, and they drag it down into their burrows where they can ingest it, and they mix it with microorganisms, and they mix it with their own feces, and they try to decompose that organic matter to make it more palatable and easier for them to ingest. And that earthworm may keep that burrow for a very long period of time at its home. It will stay there, and as long as conditions are good, it will stay there perhaps for the entirety of its life. And the third type of these horizontal burrows. And so these are moving round, I like to think almost like Brownian motion in a random direction, ingesting organic matter or distributing it around the profile. And these are the ones that I actually think are very important for generating the structure in the soil that is important for plant growth. So the vertical burrowing earthworms are very good at producing channels whereby they can take flood water or bring water into the soil. But I think that these horizontal burrowing earthworms that can sort of turn a clod of soil into this sort of nice crummy texture that we like to look at, that's particularly important for plant growth. And so my scientific hero is Charles Darwin, and about 150 years ago Charles Darwin wrote a really important book. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's called On the Formation of Vegetable Mold by the Action of Worms. And at the time, this was a much more popular book, so it outsold The Origin of Species, which I think he also worked on as well. And at the end of this book, he says that long before the plough existed, the land was in fact regularly ploughed and still continues to be thus ploughed by earthworms. So he was drawing this analogy between the earthworm and the plough, and I think that's quite an interesting analogy to dwell on, because at the moment, 150 years later, a lot of farmers, particularly in the UK, but I think globally as well, are starting to put the plough back in the shed and starting to say, okay, over to you, earthworms, perhaps you can now sort out my soil structure and do that ploughing for you. And I guess if there's one message for this talk, it's that they're not going to do it for free. You have to feed them. So they need that organic matter, they need that food to go into the soil. It's not the case that you can put the plough away, stop burning your petrol, and then sit back and let the earthworms do the job. They're going to need payment for that job. And so what the earthworms are doing is they're generating this structure that certainly I believe enables a plant root to move its way through the soil with more ease. And so they're creating these aggregates and they're creating these macropores. And the analogy that I like to use is perhaps, I came up on the train yesterday, and it wasn't a particularly busy train, and that meant that if I was wanting to go to the toilet in the middle of the carriage, then I could move my way through that train with relative ease, and if there was somebody standing in the way, they've got a place to move into, so there's lots of voids in that train. But if it was really busy and packed, so I'm sure you've all been there, in a really packed train, kind of trying to get to the other end of the carriage, and it's a very compact environment, and even if you wanted to squeeze past, there's nowhere to push somebody into, no space that they could move into. And if you've got a soil like that, it's incredibly difficult for the root to get through. I'm running out of time, so I might speed up a little bit. This is some of the work I've done, particularly looking at the idea that we need to feed these earthworms in order to get them to work for us. So here's an example in the field where we've shown that by increasing the amount of, in this case, compost or farmyard manure, we get a greater population of earthworms in the field. And then we've also done some slightly more controlled experiments in the lab here, where we've drawn a nice correlation between the amount of energy, regardless of the type of food that we add into a little pot. There's a relationship between the energy that we're adding, so the calories that we're adding and feeding that soil, and the size of the earthworms, and the earthworm biomass that's produced. And so when I was a postdoc at Rothamsted Research, I managed a number of large field trials, and this is one of the largest ones of them. We had, I think, 220 plots on this trial where we're adding various different forms of organic matter into soil with the intention of feeding the biology and trying to see if that improved the structure, which then went on to improve the yield. And so the way that we did this is we, at the same time as applying organic matter, we were applying different concentration of an important plant nutrient, nitrogen, while ensuring that the plant had all of the available nutrients that it needed. And so as we increase the amount of nitrogen that we apply to the soil, we get a higher crop yield, to the point where if we keep adding it, we don't really get any additional benefits. And then if we were to apply our amendments as well, we see these curves are shifted up slightly, so we're applying an amendment, and we think that this is due to a physical effect rather than a chemical effect. So it's long been known that if we apply these manures or these organic amendments, that they contain fertilizers, chemicals that the plant needs, but we're taking care of that by doing it on a scale of fertility, if you like. So this addition of the organic matter is providing a benefit above and beyond that which could be explained by the chemistry. And this is a good example. I've cherry-picked this one to show you, because on the next slide, we did this for several years with several different crops. And the main picture here is the fact that it's incredibly variable. It depends on what year we look at as to whether we get a positive effect, how big that positive effect might be, and which organic amendment was more beneficial. So there's quite a lot of uncertainty in this data. And so after a 4-year project, overall, we can say on average, these organic matter treatments produced a positive effect. But unfortunately, overall, we couldn't attribute that effect to an individual organism. We weren't just looking at earthworms, we were looking at microorganisms. And it seems to work, but it doesn't provide this return on investment every year. So that brings me, you'll be pleased to know, to my final slide, where I've tried to think about that. Given that uncertainty, why would a farmer want to invest in soil? So if you were on Wall Street or a hedge fund or something like that, you probably wouldn't do it, because you're not going to get a short-term return on your investment. And so I've tried to think about the farmers or the groups of people that I've met over time, and tried to sort of group them depending on whether they, I've chosen liberal or conservative. That may or may not be a wise choice, but I've also thought about their sort of short-term and long-term view, if you like. And there's a perhaps slightly unfair cartoon on the top left-hand side of people that are sort of very unwilling to change and have a kind of a short-term traditionalistic view, and so that's often because maybe they don't own the land, so why would they want to make a long-term investment? There's also sort of perhaps larger companies that you might consider making long-term investments, but also trying to ensure that they held the goals this year. They're often the larger companies, so the larger organisations. There's a lot of larger organisations that are also very enthusiastic as well, and happy to be very innovative. Finally, there's the really fun guys, or girls, the enthusiasts, I think. So these are often the people that don't so much care whether they want to make a profit out of it, because they're really fun. So they do daft things like bury their underpants in the ground and see how quickly they degrade, just so that they can see how healthy their soil are. So they're often the most fun to work with, and they're not often particularly bothered whether they're going to make a profit out of investing in the soil. It's more about the ride and the enjoyment for them. So with that, I think I've probably exceeded my time, and I'd just like to acknowledge that this is obviously a huge collaborative effort with a lot of people from Rothamsted and from Reading and other people as well. So thank you very much.
I work with farmers much of the day, and it's interesting when you say how do we get them to care about soil ecology. And Anna and I were talking about this, the idea of soil liveliness, and this idea that it can become quite a simple message of the more lively the soil, the better. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of your question of sort of then all these things start intersecting with, you know, because we don't then talk about the liveliness of pathogens, it's about the length of time it takes for carbon to cycle. And I work exclusively with upland farmers. Previously did research on carbon sequestration up in landscapes, and I think one of the issues is that what we require of those farmers in which to store soil carbon is actually the antithesis of what they see as good productive farming. So we're looking for longer term cycling, looking at higher fungal bacterial ratios, which would necessarily mean sort of less improved grassland and more sort of wetting and those kind of things. And I think it's really contextual, but I think it's also about sort of maybe being a bit less simplistic with our message as well, with this idea of soil liveliness is necessarily the be all and end all, but there is complexity, and I think getting those more complex messages across the contingency is probably the challenge we have. Because I think, like you say, I've done everything to make my soil more lively, but it hasn't. So for me,
it's be very context specific as well, depending on what they're doing. So there's two things that struck me. I think the first thing I'll say is that I quite often talk about the things that you could do when I talk to farmers to improve earthworm numbers or liveliness, if you like, in the soil. Almost everything that's good for earthworms is also good for slugs. So I do that, I get slugs and things like that. So it's and the thing is, if you've got the healthy earthworm population, that kind of in some way takes part of the slug population, but it's a chicken and egg thing. You have to have that productive system in order to look after it itself.
We're sort of expanding the idea of soil health plus, because the idea of sort of a healthy soil in the uplands being one that's carbon rich, often that means it's wetter, but then it's sort of just spreading common plants, like what that's what they're looking. So it's sort of making it bigger than the soil, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quantifying those benefits.
Just a couple of thoughts, Tom. I really enjoyed what you presented. I also started thinking about this question and how important the physical structure is, and especially for the plants, because it's going to be pretty tough, you know, putting your roots through the soil. It's not an easy medium to kind of plough through. And so I started on a bit of a thought experiment, not regarding worms, but I started to think, what if you take the soil away? And of course we've got hydroponics. And if you look at the data from hydroponics, plants grown in hydroponics tend to grow up to twice as fast as they would in the field. And I thought that was astonishing, and that indicates that you're on the right track, I think. That there should be quite a sizable effect of making it easier for the plants to put their roots through the soil. Earthworms should be a key factor in that. The other point was to do with what you showed right at the beginning from what we did in Reading, that showed the importance of carbon that we kind of agree on. We've been doing a network analysis on soil properties, looking at how things are interrelated and what's important. And the least important that came out from that in Reading, bulk density, is actually the hub. So when you do the network analysis, bulk density is the hub in that everything is interrelated and connected to bulk density, which again indicates this importance of structure. So intuitively, we all think carbon, pH, nitrogen, because those are all the things that we're seeking to manage. But that physical side we often leave out, and I think you're right on thinking about, you know, how do we articulate the importance of that physical side and how it's managed.
So to address the first one first, and so wheat plants is expected, perhaps in the UK, to reach a depth of about a metre between the time when it's drilled in maybe October until the first sort of frost, which you might expect in November, December. So that's a race. And then if we think about a spring sown crop in the UK, which might be sown in, say, March, that's got to do a lot of catching up. There was a little bit from our data that shows that this structural benefit is more of a benefit for those spring sown crops that need to really establish roots very quickly. And we also looked at some historic data from the long-term experiments that Rotham's did as well, which showed that it really depended on the weather during the spring, actually, as to whether this structure, if you like, whether organic matter had a benefit of effect. And it seemed to be that if you had a very dry spring, so hence very hard soil, then you got a much bigger boost from having organic matter in the soil than not. I'm struggling to think right now. So the second question was about the bulk density. What I was going to say about that is that in parallel to this, I've also done a survey of farmers. It's not a particularly well selected survey because it's mostly people that I give talks to or follow me on Twitter and stuff like that. And they also come up with organic matter. Unsurprisingly, earthworms is one of the top things, maybe because I bang on about earthworms. So I don't want to read too much into that. But they also came with bulk density as one of the lowest perceived soil health indicators. So that it's quite interesting that you're saying that it is underpinning. I kind of agree. It's a very easy thing to measure, and it really captures the sort of structure of the soil. Sorry, I'm here.
Thank you very much. I have two small questions. We're talking about soil health mostly. I wonder, is soil fertility at all a category soil scientists would care about and try to operationalize in some way? And the second question was about this term necromass.
Yep.
And I suppose it's dead in some way, otherwise you wouldn't call it necro. And I wonder how dead is it? I mean, what does death mean in the case of something that is still in the metabolic cycle? That's something I really have a hard time to understand.
Thin line between life and death and soil. Very thin line.
Then why would you call it necromass?
Sounds good. Oh, yeah, it sounds good. Yeah, so I think probably it's whether I guess you include the life in soil as part of the soil organic matter. So some people would include the live organisms that live in soil as part of the organic matter, in which case necromass is probably a poor way to refer to the soil organic matter, but in this example I've separated that out. I'd said the compounds that are either a product of dead microorganisms or things that have been secreted. So I guess something that's been secreted, you could suggest that it's no longer alive. So they're compounds that are a product of microorganisms. Not part of the cell, but I agree that it's kind of fairly woolly concept. But then that kind of leads me to the soil health, the soil fertility thing, and these are fairly woolly concepts as well. So we were talking about soil quality yesterday, so that was popular perhaps 20 years ago, and we're now talking about soil health. And I think that the main distinction between those two is that there's kind of an implicit understanding that the soil is alive. It's the life that seems to be the most important part of that health or that quality. And fertility is probably slightly narrower than health, I would say, and that fertility implies that you're trying to grow something in that soil, and often fertility might imply chemical fertility as well. So not necessarily, but I would say that when people talk about fertility, they often mean the amount of nutrients.
Thank you, John. I'm going to ask you to take the questions to the coffee and tea area.